The ranch had always been my sanctuary. For decades, it had been more than just land and water. It was history, tradition, and a legacy my grandfather built from the ground up. On its vast acres, horses roamed freely, cattle grazed lazily, and at the heart of it all lay the lake, a wide, serene body of water that mirrored the skies above. That lake wasn't just a feature of the land. It was the crown jewel, the place where family barbecues were held, where fishing lines were cast, and where generations of memories were carved into the rippling water. When the subdivision was built nearby and the homeowners association set its boundaries, I wasn't overly concerned. My property sat just outside their jurisdiction, large enough that I didn't fall under their endless list of rules about paint colors, mailbox styles, or how tall grass could be. I was free, or so I thought. But freedom has a way of attracting envy, and soon the HOA's eyes turned toward my lake. The president of the HOA was a woman who quickly became known to me by the nickname everyone whispered, Karen. She wasn't an ordinary Karen, though. She was relentless, with a piercing sense of entitlement and a belief that the entire neighborhood was her kingdom. She had a son in his mid-20s, spoiled and loud, who strutted around like the community owed him something. And in Karen's mind, the lake was not mine. It was a prize waiting for her to claim for her family. At first, it started small. Residents of the subdivision began showing up at the lake, picnic baskets in hand, setting up as though it were a public park. My family and I would gently remind them that it was private property, owned by me, not the HOA. Most left without. Much fuss, though a few rolled their eyes and muttered about how unfair it was that one man hogged such a beautiful place. But soon, Karen herself began showing up, walking with the air of someone inspecting her new acquisition. She'd stroll along the shoreline, making notes on a clipboard, pretending as though she had jurisdiction over the area. I brushed it off at first, assuming she was just another HOA busybody who needed to feel important. But then came the day. She made her announcement. She stood at the HOA meeting, smiling triumphantly, declaring that the lake had been gifted to her son. Without consulting me, without any legal transfer, without so much as a conversation, she claimed ownership of something that had been in my family for generations. Her justification was that the community deserved access and that the paperwork would be sorted out. Her son, grinning ear to ear, strutted around as though he had just inherited royalty. That's when the visits escalated. He began inviting his friends over, parking their trucks near the ranch gates, dragging boats and jet skis into the water, and treating the lake like his personal playground. Beer cans littered the shoreline. Music blasted into the night. Horses grew skittish from the noise, and fish that once thrived in the quiet lake began to scatter. What had been a peaceful haven was quickly becoming a chaotic mess. I tried addressing it directly, reminding them again that it was private property. But entitlement doesn't listen to reason. Karen brushed me off, claiming I was selfish for keeping such a resource to myself. Her son went further, laughing in my face and boasting that the lake is mine now. And then, one afternoon, when I threatened to involve law enforcement, Karen made her boldest move yet. She called the cops on me. She claimed that I was harassing her son on his property. When the police arrived, she waved her arms dramatically, pointing toward me as though I were the criminal. Her son smirked in the background, confident that his mother's theatrics would win the day. But when I pulled out the deed showing the officers that the land and the lake had belonged to my family long before the HOA ever existed, the situation turned awkward. The cops, caught between a shrieking Karen and hard evidence, told her she had no authority over the lake. Still, she refused to back down. To her, this wasn't about legality. It was about control. And losing control wasn't an option she was willing to entertain. She stormed off that day, muttering about lawsuits, community votes, and how I'd regret standing in her way. Her son shouted after her, still claiming victory, as though repeating the lie enough times would make it true. What Karen didn't know, though, was that her war with me had just awakened something she hadn't anticipated. Because while she may have believed she ruled the subdivision, the truth was far different. Behind the scenes, I wasn't just a rancher. I wasn't just a man with a deed. I was something much more dangerous to her empire. I was the one who controlled the HOA's budget. Through a quirk of history and a series of smart investments, I'd become the primary lender that kept their association afloat. The HOA's dream, development, its landscaping contracts, even the utilities for their clubhouse. All of it relied on lines of credit tied directly to me. Every pool cleaning, every streetlight repair, every little vanity project Karen boasted about at meetings, all of it traced back to funds I controlled. Up until that point, I'd stayed quiet, content to let them play their little power games in their cul-de-sacs while I lived peacefully on my land. But Karen had drawn the line across my lake, and in doing so, she'd forced me to reveal a truth she never saw coming. The lake wasn't hers. The land wasn't hers. And soon, the HOA's entire budget, the lifeline of her control, wouldn't be hers either. The seeds of revenge were already planted, and as Karen dug in, believing she had won some kind of victory, she had no idea that the ground beneath her feet was about to collapse. Karen had strutted away from that confrontation at the lake, convinced she had somehow won. Her son boasted to his friends about owning the water, and soon enough, the HOA gossip network buzzed with the story that I had been put in my place. But what Karen didn't know was that while she controlled the microphone at neighborhood meetings, I controlled the money that powered her every word. The HOA wasn't self-sustaining, no matter how loudly they boasted about their reserves and dues. When the community was first built, the developer had overextended themselves, and I had been the one to step in quietly as a private lender. The contracts were ironclad, structured, so that I became the financial backbone of the subdivision. Every landscaping bill, every repair project, every insurance policy, and every utility for their clubhouse was paid out of an account I had under my thumb. For years, I had let them operate freely. I saw no need to flaunt my position. I enjoyed the peace and didn't care to meddle in their politics. But now, things were different. Karen had crossed the line by attacking my family's property and trying to rewrite ownership with nothing but entitlement and bravado. It was time she learned that her empire of rules and threats rested on fragile legs, and I was the one who held the axe. The first step was subtle. I reviewed the HOA's most recent budget requests and simply delayed. The lawn care company that trimmed the community's manicured greens didn't receive their check on time. Trash pickup, usually handled by a contracted service, mysteriously had invoices pending. The pool maintenance team called, wondering why they hadn't been paid. I didn't outright cut anything yet. I just slowed the gears. And like clockwork, the perfect little neighborhood began to show cracks. Grass grew just a little higher than the strict code allowed. Trash bins lingered longer on the curbs. The pool, a shining symbol of the HOA's pride, developed cloudy water from missed treatments. Residents grumbled, confused as to why their sky-high HOA dues weren't maintaining their pristine environment. Whispers began to spread at the same meetings where Karen loved to boast. Of course, she tried to cover it up. She blamed contractors for being lazy and accused homeowners of failing to follow rules. She barked at them to trim their lawns and fined them for leaving bins out. But no matter how loudly she pointed fingers, the truth was harder to hide with each passing week. The HOA's carefully polished image was slipping, and then I tightened the strings. The next round of payments I held back were for the utilities tied to their beloved clubhouse. That building was Karen's stage, the place where she lorded over the residents, handing out warnings and fines like candy. Without warning, the electricity bill went unpaid. One evening, as she prepared to hold her grand meeting, the lights flickered and died. Residents sat in darkness, fanning themselves in the heat, while Karen scrambled to explain how such a thing could happen. The clubhouse, once her fortress, became a source of humiliation. Still, she didn't back down. If anything, her entitlement grew sharper. She doubled her efforts to claim my lake, insisting more loudly at every meeting that it was community property. She boasted that her son was improving it with his parties and gatherings, as though litter and noise were some form of beautification. But her words rang hollow as residents began to grow impatient. They paid their dues, yet their lawns grew scraggly, their streets weren't cleaned, and their facilities faltered. They wanted answers. That's when I decided it was time for the second step: exposure. I reached out to a few of the quieter residents, the ones who had always seemed more reasonable and less entranced by Karen's theatrics. Without fanfare, I showed them the truth. I revealed the lending contracts, the financial ties, the budgetary strings that connected their HOA to me. I explained how Karen's reckless actions and hostile behavior had provoked the delays they were now suffering through. It didn't take long for word to spread. At first, whispers crept through the neighborhood, small pockets of homeowners questioning Karen's version of events. Then, during the next meeting, the murmurs erupted into open confrontation. People demanded to know why their payments were so high, why services were failing, and why Karen seemed more concerned with claiming a private lake than managing the community they paid her to oversee. Karen tried to shout them down, of course. She always did. She waved her hands, shouted about jealous neighbors and outside troublemakers, but her shrill tone didn't land the way it once had. For the first time, her authority wavered. For the first time, she wasn't in complete control of the room, and still, she didn't see the trap closing in. The real pressure came when vendors began refusing service until payments cleared. The lawn company pulled out entirely, leaving the neighborhood looking unkempt. Trash piled up after collection was halted for non-payment. Even the pool, the last jewel of their community, was padlocked when the maintenance crew refused to work without compensation. By then, homeowners were furious. They began organizing against her, demanding financial transparency. They wanted to know where their money was going and why their community was collapsing. And when some of them learned the truth, that the HOA's entire budget rested on my approval, they realized Karen wasn't nearly as powerful as she pretended to be. Through it all, I remained calm, watching from the ranch as the subdivision unraveled under her mismanagement. My lake shimmered under the sun, still mine, still protected by the deed that no tantrum or false claim could erase. And as Karen grew more desperate, her son more arrogant, and the community more divided, I knew the next step was coming. Because Karen's greatest weapon had always been intimidation, fines, threats, and loud accusations. But now, her residents no longer feared her. They feared the decay around them, the slow collapse of their neighborhood, and they began to turn on the one who had promised them order and delivered chaos. What Karen didn't yet realize was that this wasn't just about the lake anymore. It wasn't just about property lines or petty squabbles. This was about power. And by trying to take from me, she had handed me the perfect opportunity to dismantle hers piece by piece. The financial strings had been pulled, the cracks were widening, and her empire of control was trembling. The stage was set for the next move, and when it came, it would leave her reeling in a way she had never experienced before. Because this time, it wouldn't just be about budgets or broken services. This time, it would be about exposing Karen herself. The collapse of Karen's spotless kingdom had begun with whispers, but by now those whispers had grown into open resentment. The neatly trimmed lawns had turned shaggy, trash bins overflowed on curbs, and the once pristine clubhouse sat locked and useless. Neighbors who once boasted about living in the best-managed community in the county now grumbled about missed services, misplaced funds, and broken promises. At the center of it all was Karen, clinging desperately to her crown. To her, none of this was her fault. She pointed fingers in every direction, at the contractors, at the residents, even at me. She painted me as the villain in her story, a greedy landowner trying to undermine the community by withholding access to their lake. Her son echoed her lies, parading around with his friends, still treating my lake like his playground, even as the HOA crumbled around them. But while Karen shouted louder, her voice no longer carried the same weight. Homeowners had begun to question the finances, asking why their dues weren't covering the essentials. They demanded transparency, but Karen deflected, waving her hands and claiming the details were complicated. For years, that excuse had been enough. Not anymore. The time was right. If the HOA members were going to see the truth, they needed more than whispers. They needed evidence, undeniable proof that their self-proclaimed queen was nothing more than a fraud balancing her power on lies. And I had exactly what they needed. I didn't go to the whole community at once. That would have been chaos, and Karen would have spun it into another performance about being attacked. Instead, I reached out again to the quieter residents, the ones who were already suspicious. Over coffee at kitchen tables and quiet conversations in driveways, I laid it out for them. I showed them the lending contracts, the records of every financial tie the HOA had to me. I explained how Karen's reckless behavior had provoked the delays, how her mismanagement was now threatening the very community she claimed to protect. When they saw the documents, their eyes widened. The truth hit them harder than any rumor could. They weren't just being misled, they were being ruled by someone who had no real power at all. And once the first few residents understood, they carried the truth to others. Slowly but steadily, the neighborhood turned. The next HOA meeting was unlike any before. Gone were the nodding heads and polite silence Karen had grown accustomed to. Instead, residents arrived with questions, papers, and a simmering anger. The air was thick with tension, the kind of tension that builds when people realize they've been fooled. Karen took her usual place at the front of the room, her voice sharp and commanding as she rattled off complaints about lawn height and parking violations. But she could feel it, the shift. The audience wasn't with her. They weren't nodding, they weren't intimidated, they were waiting. And then the first question came. A homeowner stood and asked where exactly their dues were going. Another demanded to see the financial records. A third brought up the failing services, wondering why contractors weren't being paid. Karen floundered, waving her hands and insisting the details weren't for them to worry about. But the residents didn't back down this time. They pressed harder, demanding answers, demanding transparency, demanding proof. It was then that one of the residents I had spoken to, an older man who had lived there since the subdivision was built, stood up with a folder in hand. He laid out the documents I had given him, proof of the HOA's dependency on my loans, proof of the financial strings Karen had hidden from them all. The room erupted. Gasps, mutters, and shouts filled the air as the truth spilled out for everyone to see. Karen tried to shout over them, calling the documents fake, insisting it was all a smear campaign, but the evidence was too strong, and the residents were no longer under her spell. One by one, they began demanding her resignation. They wanted new leadership, someone who could repair the damage she had caused. Her face flushed red, her hands trembled, and her voice cracked as she tried to claw back control. She accused the residents of betrayal, accused me of orchestrating everything, accused everyone but herself. But the more she ranted, the clearer it became that her grip was slipping. Her son, never one to accept reality, tried to storm into the meeting, shouting that his lake rights were being violated. But that only made things worse. The residents laughed at him, some openly mocking his claim. "You don't even pay dues," one of them snapped. His entitlement, once tolerated under his mother's shield, was now just another sign of how out of touch Karen's family truly was. For the first time, Karen was cornered, the queen of fines. And threats. The woman who had ruled with an iron fist now stood exposed before the very people she had controlled. And though she didn't step down that night, the damage was done. Her credibility was shattered. Her neighbors no longer feared her. They no longer respected her. And without fear or respect, her power was nothing but smoke. But I wasn't finished. Exposing Karen had been necessary, but it wasn't enough. She still strutted around the lake with her son, still tried to assert authority she didn't have. And until that ended, the harassment wouldn't stop. I knew she would keep pushing, keep fighting, keep pretending she held power she no longer had. So I planned the next step. If the residents had seen her weakness, they needed to see her defeat. They needed proof that not only was she powerless, but that her attempts to claim my property would cost her everything, because Karen had crossed a line, and lines have consequences. As I looked out over the lake one evening, the water glistening under the fading sun, I knew the final act was coming. Karen believed she could gift my land to her son, call the cops on me, and scream her way into ownership. But soon, she was about to learn the truth. The lake was mine, the budget was mine, and soon her downfall would be complete. The residents had already begun to turn against Karen after the truth of the finances came to light. But in her mind, none of it mattered. She still clung to the one fantasy that gave her power: the lake. It wasn't hers, it had never been hers, but she insisted it was community property, and more importantly, a gift she had given to her son. That lie had become her shield, and she wielded it with the same arrogance she had always used to enforce her petty HOA rules. But the community's patience had run thin. The clubhouse sat dark and lifeless, lawns were unkempt, and the pool was closed. People no longer whispered about Karen, they cursed her openly. Still, she poured her energy into the lake. Every week, she and her son hosted gatherings there. Loud, messy, and disruptive. Trucks lined the roads near my gates, music echoed across the water, and beer cans and trash floated along the once pristine shoreline. I tolerated it longer than most would have. The reason was simple. I wanted Karen to show her hand. I wanted her to push so far, so arrogantly, that her collapse would be witnessed by the very residents she claimed to lead. And finally, the day came when she crossed that last line. It started with her son. Flush with arrogance, he decided to expand his so-called ownership. He hauled in a floating dock, bought second-hand boats, and even began charging his friends for lake access passes. In his mind, he wasn't just enjoying a gift, he was running a business, and Karen encouraged it, boasting at HOA meetings that her son was bringing value to the community. She even had flyers printed, advertising exclusive use of the lake for residents. When the first of those flyers landed in mailboxes, the neighborhood erupted. Some laughed at the absurdity. Others were furious that their already high HOA dues were apparently being used to fund her son's delusion. But Karen didn't care. She stood in the center of it all, basking in her son's scam as though it were proof of her legacy. That was when I knew it was time to act. The first step was legal. Quietly, I contacted the county sheriff's office and provided them with copies of the deed, along with evidence of trespassing and unauthorized commercial use of my property. The sheriff knew the land well. My family had owned it long before. The subdivision existed. He assured me they would respond swiftly the next time Karen or her son attempted to claim the lake. The second step was tactical. I informed several of the more reasonable residents about what was about to happen. Not in dramatic detail, just enough to ensure that when the showdown occurred, it wouldn't be hidden. Karen thrived on controlling the narrative, but this time, the narrative would play out in front of the very people who had begun doubting her. And then, the day arrived. Karen's son was throwing another one of his parties, complete with music blasting from speakers and boats bobbing on the water. Trucks clogged the roadside, kids splashed noisily, and garbage already lined the grass. Karen, dressed as though she were hosting a royal gala, strutted along the shoreline, smiling proudly. She had convinced herself that this chaos was proof of her victory. That was when the sheriff's cars pulled up. Two cruisers rolled to a stop, lights flashing but sirens silent, and officers stepped out with a calm but purposeful stride. The crowd went quiet. Karen's son froze mid-laugh, beer still in his hand, as the sheriff approached. The officers explained firmly, clearly, that this was private property and that all unauthorized gatherings had to end immediately. Karen exploded. She shrieked about harassment, waved her arms wildly, and declared the lake was hers to gift. She pointed at her son, demanding they respect his ownership. But when the sheriff held up the deed with my name clearly listed, the weight of the truth crashed over the crowd. Her son protested, shouting that his mother had promised him the lake. The sheriff's reply was simple. Promises don't trump property law. The officers ordered everyone to clear out, warning that further trespassing would lead to arrests. Friends of her son quickly packed up their things, muttering about not wanting to get involved in family drama. The floating dock was dismantled. The boats were dragged back onto trailers. One by one, the so-called lake party disbanded. But Karen wasn't finished. She screamed at the sheriff, at her neighbors, at me, though I hadn't said a word. She shouted that it was all unfair, that I was selfish, that the community deserved the lake. Her voice cracked as she realized no one was siding with her anymore. The very neighbors she had bullied for years stood silently, arms crossed, watching her unravel. Some even shook their heads in disgust. In that moment, her empire collapsed not with a bang, but with silence. The crowd wasn't afraid of her anymore. They weren't impressed. They were done. The sheriff issued a final warning. Any further attempts to claim or use the lake without permission would result in criminal charges. He handed Karen a copy of the trespass notice, signed and sealed, before turning back to his car. Her son slumped beside her, humiliated, the smirk wiped clean from his face. As the cruisers drove away, Karen stood trembling, clutching the useless notice in her hand. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving her exposed and powerless on the shoreline. She shouted after them, trying to rally support, but no one listened. They had seen enough. From my porch across the water, I watched it all unfold. The lake was still mine, as it had always been. The law had spoken. The residents had witnessed the truth, and Karen's fantasy had been torn apart in the open air. But the story wasn't finished, because while Karen had lost her battle for the lake, she still held the HOA's gavel, at least in name. She would cling to it as long as she could, desperate to salvage whatever scraps of power remained. And though the residents no longer trusted her, she wasn't the type to bow out gracefully. Her reign was crumbling, but she would go down swinging. And I knew the final chapter of her downfall was coming soon. The lake was safe. The residents had seen the truth. Now it was time to make sure Karen's hold over the HOA itself ended once and for all. Karen's defeat at the lake was supposed to be the end of her crusade, at least in the eyes of her neighbors. The sheriff had made it clear. The lake was mine. Trespassing would lead to arrests. And her son's childish dream of being a lake owner was crushed. The community had watched it all unfold with their own eyes. They knew the truth now, and her lies no longer carried weight. But Karen was not the type to bow out gracefully. For years, she had ruled with her voice, her clipboard, and her ability to intimidate. To her, the lake debacle wasn't the end. It was merely a setback. She still had the HOA gavel, and she still clung to it with white-knuckled desperation. In her mind, as long as she stood at the front of those meetings, she was queen. The problem was, her kingdom was collapsing beneath her. The residents were restless. Their lawns were unkempt because landscaping contracts had been canceled. Trash piled up because payments hadn't been made. The pool sat drained, covered in algae. The once shiny clubhouse, her fortress of power, was locked and dark. And every month, The dues still rolled in, but nobody could see where the money was going. Whispers turned into accusations. Accusations turned into demands. And soon, the demands turned into signatures. Signatures on a petition to call a vote to remove Karen as HOA president. I watched it all unfold quietly, knowing my financial strings had helped loosen the bolts of her throne. But it wasn't my hand pushing her out. It was her neighbors. The very people she had fined, threatened, and bullied for years were finally uniting against her. The night of the vote was something out of a drama script. The clubhouse lights had finally been restored for the occasion, but the building no longer felt like Karen's castle. It felt like a courtroom with rows of residents seated, arms folded, waiting for judgment. At the front stood Karen, still trying to command the room, her gavel clutched tightly like a scepter she refused to surrender. She opened the meeting with her usual routine, barking about rule violations, warning about fines, and blaming everyone, but herself, for the community's decline. But the crowd wasn't listening. They weren't intimidated. They were waiting for the motion that had brought them there. And then it came. A resident stood, paper in hand, and announced the petition. The signatures had been collected. The demand was official. They were calling a vote to remove Karen from her position as HOA president. The room erupted. Some cheered, some shouted, and Karen herself nearly lost her footing. She slammed the gavel, insisting the motion was invalid, that the rules didn't allow it, that she was the rightful leader. But no one listened. The rules were clear, and for once, they weren't working in her favor. The vote was called. One by one, residents raised their hands. The tally grew lopsided quickly. Dozens against her, only a sparse handful in her favor. Mostly, her son and the few neighbors still too afraid to cross her directly. By the time the count was finished, the result was undeniable. Karen had been removed. The gavel, once her weapon, was taken from her hand and passed to a newly elected president, a quiet, level-headed woman who had long endured Karen's rule in silence. For the first time, the HOA was free from Karen's grip. But if anyone thought she would leave with dignity, they didn't know Karen. She erupted into a fit, screaming that it was all a conspiracy, that the community was ungrateful, that I had orchestrated everything to destroy her. Her son tried to rally behind her, shouting that the lake was still his, only to be laughed at by the crowd. Their tantrum, once a tool of fear, was now nothing more than a spectacle. Neighbors shook their heads, embarrassed they had ever followed her lead. Security was eventually called to escort her out. She fought every step of the way, clutching her purse and her pride, shrieking that the community would regret this. But the truth was, they already regretted ever letting her hold power in the first place. When the doors closed behind her, a strange quiet fell over the room. For the first time in years, residents felt relief. The queen had fallen, and her reign was over. In the weeks that followed, the HOA began to rebuild. New contracts were signed, payments flowed again, and the neighborhood slowly regained its shine. Lawns were trimmed, trash was collected, and the pool reopened. The new president focused on repairing trust, holding transparent meetings where finances were shared openly. The residents, once fractured by fear, began to feel like a community again. As for the lake, it returned to what it had always been, a family treasure. No parties, no litter, no false claims, just quiet mornings with fishing lines in the water, evenings watching the sun set across the ripples, and the peace that came with knowing the nightmare was over. Karen, of course, didn't disappear entirely. She lingered on the edges, muttering about lawsuits, threatening appeals, and gossiping to anyone who would listen. But without the HOA gavel in her hand, her voice carried no weight. She was just another angry neighbor, her power stripped away. Her son sulked beside her, his dreams of owning the lake long gone, his friends no longer interested in following him without the lure of free parties. The irony was almost poetic. Karen had tried to take something that wasn't hers, had tried to crown her son with a legacy built on lies. In doing so, she hadn't just lost the lake, she had lost everything: her authority, her reputation, her throne. The queen of the HOA had fallen, not by my hand alone, but by the weight of her own arrogance. And as I stood on my porch one evening looking out at the calm water of the lake, I couldn't help but smile. She had called the cops on me, gifted my land to her son, and tried to intimidate me into surrender. She hadn't known the truth then, that I controlled her budget. She hadn't realized that every fine she wrote, every rule she enforced, every meeting she held, all of it was funded by strings I held in my hands. Now she knew, and the community knew too. The story of Karen's reign wasn't one of power, but of downfall. She had ruled with noise and fear, but in the end, it was silence that defeated her. Silence from neighbors who no longer listened. Silence from contractors who no longer worked for her. Silence from a community that had finally had enough. The lake was mine, the ranch was mine, and peace at long last was mine again.